Blend modes are a great way to change a photograph that might not be the best photograph in the world, or it might not have the best lighting. So without having to go in and actually edit the actual image in something like Lightroom or Photoshop, there's a lot of things that you can do just with the blend modes. And the blend modes will work for any object, but I want to talk specifically about photographs and images. It's going to be pretty much the same in Sketch, Figma, Studio, Adobe XD, Framer. All of these design tools are gonna have basically the same blend modes. So you used to not be able to use blend modes with code, but now with the advancement of CSS and many other programming languages like Swift and things like that, you can actually affect the blend mode of a photograph with code. And so we're not really going to dive into the whole code thing, but I just want to point out the certain blend modes that come in handy when I'm designing with images. So we've all seen this little layer panel over here, and we've got all of our blend modes here. Pass through, normal, darken, multiply, color burn, on and on and on and on, all these different ones. Now, you can pretty much go and figure out which each of them do just by putting an image on a background and then just changing it and seeing if anything happens. Really, that's the easiest way to figure out what everything does. But rather than you have to go through and do that, I've made just a simple little list. So pass through. So this is it really only pertains to an actual group of things. So right now, this is one group, and each one of these images has its own layer effect applied. So this one's pass through, this one's color burn, this one's overlay, this one's darken. But look what happens if I change this entire thing to, say, luminosity. So all of a sudden I've changed the entire group layer effect to luminosity, which is the same thing as changing an individual object to luminosity. And so even though each one of these has different layer effects added to it, that kind of cancels it out. So if the group is not set to pass through, then the individual blend modes, they won't matter because you're setting that at the group level. And so that's really all pass through does. It just lets the individual elements pass through the group, and there's no actual layer effect added. Same thing if you go to normal, everything's going to be normal. So pass through only applies to groups of objects with blend modes applied. It's not really that big of a deal, but it's a subtle difference if you're trying to figure this all out. All right, normal, not really anything to cover here. It's just images as you would expect them to appear. So let's really dig into these four. These are the ones that I use the most if I use them. So multiply. Multiply is gonna knock out all of the white. So if you have certain backgrounds and you wanna get rid of all the white, you can see that if I bring the normal image beside it, see this one's set to normal, this one's set to multiply, you can see that all of these light areas start to kind of get knocked out. And if I went even more extreme and I started adjusting the exposure and maybe added some highlights, maybe bring down the shadows, and just kind of adjust this a little bit more. So look what happens if I make this one normal. So now you can get a better idea of how multiply could work a lot more powerfully, especially if you have pure white in your photograph. So it basically almost cuts it out. Like I haven't fully gotten rid of that full amount of white. Could probably bump up the contrast and the exposure just a little bit. And so now we're getting like a full bleed through of the background anywhere there's white. So this can be like a really cool effect. I think this photograph in general, like it looks kind of neat like that, especially on this background. And then with any color that you might change your background, it's just gonna bleed through a little bit more. So if I go in here and start adjusting the background color, you can see that anywhere there's white, it's just gonna start bleeding through, and the multiply really just starts to knock out all white. So especially, like I said, you can do it without adjusting any of the exposure or the saturation or anything like that, and it will still have a certain effect. But when it really shines the most is when you have adjusted your photograph a little bit to have this really bright white, then you can knock it out completely. Although this is an interesting look as well. So let's get rid, well, you know what? I'll just leave these here as an example. You can go through and check those out. Okay, so screen. Screen is gonna be the exact opposite of multiply. And the exact opposite here, you're gonna knock out all of the black. So anything dark here. So if I take this image again, the one that we've kind of jacked up the contrast. So watch what happens if I go really dark. So go really dark on the shadows. Let's try to bring up the contrast. Maybe we go down on the exposure a little bit just so we have more black to work with. So now if I have this one as normal and I go screen, you're gonna be able to see this a little bit better because we have a much darker of an area. If you have a black background like I've got here, a lot of the things that I overlay on the screen, I export with a black background and I actually set it to screen inside of Final Cut. That way only the white letters show up, something kind of like this. It can be handy, especially for overlaying something with a full black background with a solid white, and you just want to kind of knock it out really quickly. Okay, overlay. Overlay is something that you can kind of experiment with. Like the note says here, it's kind of a combination of multiply and screen, and it gives roughly like a 50% strength to the white and the black, and it kind of brings it all down together. So it's kind of like a middle ground between screen and multiply. And before I go on to luminosity, I would say that multiply and screen I use quite often because sometimes you want to knock out all the white, sometimes you want to knock out all the black. So if you go in and you edit your photograph to be a lot darker, a lot more black in those areas, the shadows, or your highlights to be really white, it's just an easy way to knock that out without having to go in and do a bunch of retouching in Photoshop, anything like that. So overlay, I don't use it quite as much unless I'm trying to come up with some kind of cool effect, but I just don't use overlay quite as much. Now luminosity, I feel that luminosity is one of the, beyond multiply and screen, luminosity is the one that I use quite often if I'm trying to really create some kind of environment with the photograph and the interface, and I don't want to have to do a lot of Photoshop or photo manipulation or adjusting white balance or all of the things associated with editing photographs. So luminosity, it's going to preserve the hue and the saturation of the base layer. And it's going to adopt the luminosity of the blend layer. So you can see here, this one is normal. And if I went in here and I actually just add, let's see if I can add an avatar to this symbol. Not sure if it'll let me. Let's just create another quick circle here. And I'm going to set this to luminosity. So you can see that really any color, it's going to start to take on that background color. It just blends it through. So really any color photograph, it's going to take on that background color. So we'll put luminosity there and let's give ourselves an avatar and let's get ourselves a few more avatars right in here. There we go. Run the avatar plugin again. So all of these different images, they start to look kind of like they're in a group, like in a family, because they're all bringing in that background color. And if I go and I change this background color, they're all going to change based on that base layer. So they all look kind of purple, they all look kind of pink, they all look kind of red. And it's just like a cool way to adjust all of the photographs at one time. And another thing that you can kind of start to do, you can select these and then you can start to play around with the actual opacity. So if 0% is nothing, 100% is 100%, you can actually start to reduce the opacity a little bit and it almost like softens them a little bit more. Now, I don't know if you would want to go with a 50% photo, but it just kind of is a way to start to adjust the actual image. And this works much better if you're using a really large background image. Luminosity overall is probably the one that I use to kind of edit a photograph without actually having to edit it. So just to show a simple way to kind of create a bunch of similarly styled avatars without actually having the means to do a proper photo shoot with the same background. So let's just give ourselves a couple of circles here. So we got 4, Option, Shift, bring this down. We'll do it right in there. And then let's just do 12. So I'm gonna run the avatars plugin again on all these shapes. Let's just see here. So we've got black and white photos. We've got almost, like a more of a professional looking photo, and then more of like an iPhone picture snap. So lots of different variety for these photographs, but watch what happens if we do the same thing. And I actually need to put a gradient on this first. I'm gonna add a fill and put it beneath the image by dragging this down below. And let's just add a type of gradient from color to color. Let's hide the image really quickly. And we'll just do it at an angle just to be a little different, just to mix it up a bit. So we're gonna go from like a red to a blue, something right in there. Maybe we'll go with like a slightly pinkish color. All right, so now that I have the gradient here, this is kind of interesting. You can put different blend modes on the actual fill. So in order to do that, you click into this and then you want to hit this little droplet icon. That's going to pull up the individual fill and click luminosity. And really that's going to be the same thing as taking 2 different backgrounds and just putting this on top and changing the layer to luminosity. So there's different ways to do it. And you can see there's kind of an interesting effect that happens when you're pulling this over. And you could even do something like that. It might be easier to control. You could even create like a component out of this, call this like gradient avatar. That way you have 2 different things to control. So then we could make a selection duplicate of this, and let's get our 12 avatars. And now I'm gonna go in and actually like just manually click into that first layer. So now you can see I'm Command Shift clicking and I'm getting just that top layer, and I'm gonna run the avatars plugin and it's gonna replace all those images. And so now you can see I've got like some celebrity photos, I've got Ryan Reynolds here, and then lots of other iPhone non-professional photographs. But if you kind of just look at everything, it's got kind of like a similar look and feel. So a lot of times magazines will do this. I know Smashing Mag has kind of this orange gradient that they put on a lot of their contributors' avatars because they get a lot of different headshots from a lot of different people. So it's just kind of an easy way to make it kind of a consistent look. And you can go in and experiment with all of these. So because they all have that same base, now you can see the selection colors popping up, and we can actually go in here and just change the entire look of the entire avatar just by going in here and changing that base layer. Because it's at luminosity, it's always gonna just shine through the bottom. It's gonna just shine through the photograph. And we can go in here and Command click and select all of this again. Actually, we can just Command click the master symbol or the master component, and you could go in here and change it if you wanted to multiply, screen. You can play with lighten and soft light and all these others. They're not gonna do that much for you. I definitely like to do multiply, screen. Occasionally you can do overlay, but it's more for like stylistic effect. Most of the time luminosity is gonna be where it's at. And if we wanted to, we can go in here and we can say, let's go back and reset the overrides, those images selected, and run my avatars plugin. An interesting way to make a bunch of avatars seem like they're possibly part of the same family. And then finally, this works really well for like big hero images. So imagine I've got a big desktop MacBook Pro size screen here. All right, so I'm gonna recreate this just a little bit. So I've got this big image. Let's cut it out of here. Let's go to normal and 100%. All right, so this image is straight out of Unsplash, and say we want to use this like big hero image for our website, but we want this text and this button to be right on top of it because we need to, we got to have some text and everything. Well, that's just not going to work. you know, you could try to experiment putting this over here, or maybe this is over there. But a lot of times if you want to go text on images, it's just not going to work with just full on photographs. I mean, you could do something like this, and you've seen what we've done with some gradient overlays and some blurs, but having this as a blend mode and pulling in some color from the background is a really great way to manipulate photos with color, and that way it allows the text to be on it. So let's go ahead and give our background of this frame. Right now it's set to white. So let's give ourselves a nice pink color. There we go. All right, so all of a sudden, let's go here and let's change this to luminosity. Okay, that's a little bit too intense. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna lower the opacity of our image. We're like, okay, this is looking a little bit better, but still the background color, a little bit too bright. You know, that's not gonna pass accessibility. We're definitely gonna get dinged for that. See, it's a failing score. Let's go back in here and adjust the background. Just bring it on down. Right in here, we could try a different hue. You can bring it down, and you can play with the background color and the opacity of the image, and you can kind of adjust those two things to kind of come up with a nice, flat, soft thing that works for the background. So this might be a little dark, you know, it kind of just depends on your project, but it's gonna work. That photo is just gonna start blending in with the background color. Same way that these avatars do. Really, this is the same thing that I did here. I just have a gradient in the background. So if you go in here, you can see that I'm using this as a mask just to mask the image, but this right here is my linear gradient. So if I went in here and changed this, you can see that the image is going to change because the image is set to luminosity. So luminosity and image opacity are going to be the two things that you can really control to make these cool background image effects. Same way we're kind of using the same trick for these avatars and then the same trick for this hero image. So those are the blend modes that I want you to become most familiar with: multiply, screen, and luminosity. Those are gonna be like the top three that'll give you the most bang for your buck. So for your blend mode homework, I want you to create something similar to what we did here with like a group of avatars. Experiment with background colors, with gradients, and bring in avatars and try to make them, you know, feel like they're part of a family. And then create like a big hero image with some type of background that might not typically work as your background image, but because you're gonna reduce the opacity way down to like 50, 40, 30, 20%, and then you're gonna play with that background color with the image set at luminosity, just try to create some kind of hero image, like a title, body text, and a call to action, just to kind of get a feel for how you can layer these things together and get these images working for your next project. So go ahead and get started on that homework, and I can't wait to see what you come up with.